Hey guys, Trent at Black Horse Ranch, and we're following up here on our Duramax project. And so you can see behind me, we've got the LBZ pulled, and it's got the Allison and the transfer case attached still. And she's just about ready to go back in. There's a couple other little things we got to do, but for the most part, she's ready. So this video, I just wanted to talk about some things that you should consider. Basically all the stuff that I'm finding out if you're gonna attempt to do a swap where you're putting like an LBZ, which is from a GMT800, into a 1500 GMT900 platform. So up to 2007.5, that was considered the classic body style, and then that's the GMT800 platform. The GMT900 platform is the last half of 2007, and then up to 2020. I don't know where the GMT900 platform ends, but I know they're pretty similar up to 2013. So that's what we're talking about now. So there's a lot of differences. And so my first consideration, I guess, or recommendation is that if you're going to do that swap, you're better off going with a new body style donor, just because there's so many differences. I think you still run into some of these issues, even though I think the conversion in the classic body style was a lot easier from what I'm seeing. But I'll basically go through some of the stuff that I've learned or that we're dealing with to try to get this conversion to work, just so you're aware of it and you know what it's going to take if you get into it. We're going to see this through to the end, so it'll be a little bit more expensive than it would have been, with the classic body style. But we like this body style. If we would have had a new body style donor, so like an LMM instead of an LBZ, it would be a little bit easier. So I'm just going to hit some of the stuff. So we're still in the middle of this. I don't know that this is an all-inclusive list. If I find more stuff that is consideration, so we'll make another video and we'll adjust those considerations as well. But this video is just going to be about the things that you should consider, and I'll just kind of highlight the differences, and then I'll do more detailed videos as we go. I'm really on a deadline, and we're trying to get this done by the end of April. So we're like I think today's the 18th or 19th of March. And so we're trying to get this pushed through so we can be done by the end of April. So we still got a lot of stuff to do. So one of the first things to consider is wiring. And so that's, if you look online, that's one of the biggest discussions that you'll find when converting from the 1500, when you're converting from the GMT800 to the GMT900 platform. So stuff that I've read is, you'll need different modules because they changed the communication. So GM doesn't use the class 2 communication anymore. Going to the new body style, they started using the GM LAN low speed to replace that. And GM LAN high speed was already there, and they've used that across both platforms. But even the wiring for that is different. So the modules that you'll need to consider if you're going to do an LBZ into a GMT900 platform. So you'll need the ECM, obviously. You'll need the TCM, so engine control module, transmission control module, glow plug control module. So those are the three modules that I had to get, or that I did get for this. And Hicksville Auto Salvage in Ohio is a really good resource for that. Pretty fairly priced. So those three modules, but there's one module that I didn't look at. The four-wheel drive module also uses GM LAN communication now, where it didn't in the previous classic version. So in the GMT800 platform, the four-wheel drive module was basically standalone. It didn't have other communications or it used class 2, I think is maybe the case. But my hunch and what I'm going to try with this is I'm going to use the 4-wheel drive module from the GMT800, just because the other module is kind of hard to deal with. I mean, there's more to it than that, and I'll get into it more, but it's the new module. There's a different switch, actuator switch. There's a different actuator motor on the transfer case. And they're wired completely different, so you can't just clip the pigtail off and solder it to the old one. So you're talking about a different transfer case, a different 4-wheel drive module, and so it kind of gets pretty complex when you start getting into that. Transfer case is like, if you get one at a junkyard, you're talking probably more than $1,000. And then the module new was like $400, and then we're using a Denali, which has all-wheel drive, so there's no 4-wheel drive functionality as far as switching out of 4-wheel drive. It's just always in basically all-wheel drive. So there's none of that wiring is in there and that kind of stuff. So, but I think the communication from the 4-wheel drive module to is to the instrument cluster to give it the little 4-wheel drive 4 low, 4 high indicator on the dash. But the new button is the knob, I guess, and the old push button style. I think they're wired very similar, and they indicate what function you're in. So I'm going to try to bypass the communication and just leave it not connected, and see if the switch will still use the old module and still switch the old transfer case and actuate the front diff and put it in gear. So anyway, don't forget about the 4-wheel drive module and the 4-wheel drive system. So I went into a little bit more detail on that. So there's the accelerator pedal is different. So you can take the LBZ accelerator pedal, which I'm doing, but you have to cut the connector off and resolder it onto the wiring that's in the GMT900. The connectors are completely different, and the internals are different. So you pretty much have to either get a newer pedal, like for the LMM, and it might plug in, I don't know, or you have to do the splice, like that's what we're gonna do. So that's one of the things where having a donor from the same vintage GMT900 would probably be beneficial. The battery wiring is completely different. So the GMT900 platform uses a mega fuse block, and so there's 3 big fuses on there that feed the fuse block, the glow plug module, and one other thing I don't remember. But anyway, that all happens on the passenger side, where on the classic body style or the LBZ, it's happens on the driver's side. So I think the battery cables are going to be different. We haven't gotten to that point yet. I know they're going to be different somehow, but I don't know if I can, make use of the old ones or not. Those are the main wiring differences. So I can get into later. I'll get into another video and I'll go into more detail. The wiring harness differences are so complex that I'm not sure I can actually do a good job of showing you what to do in a video. So it's possible that I might make those available at some point. Basically, I went through both vehicles' wiring diagrams on the GM website and drew up a wiring diagram that shows the whole engine connection, and figured out what to splice, because you have to completely splice connectors. And I don't know. So what I did is I got an engine harness from a salvage yard, and that was the harness that connects into the vehicle. So it has the adapter, or it has the plug that goes into the fuse block. It has the transmission wiring, and it has the main connector that goes up and connects to the actual engine harness. So maybe if you got that harness and I don't know if it's called the injector harness or whatever, that might work okay. I don't know what the differences are. So basically I kept the LBZ harness on my engine, and I just got the harness that connects into the vehicle, and so the main connectors are different where the engine harness connects to the vehicle harness. They're both female if you use the new LMM style and the LBZ, so one of them has to go. So I've spliced the old LBZ connector onto the LMM harness, and so I had to trace out all the wiring. Plus, when you're going LBZ to LMM, the LMM has a DPF, so there's extra wires that you're not going to use and that kind of thing. So anyway, I can get into more of that kind of detail later on. So one of the things you'll have to consider, I guess either way, is if you're going to keep the EGR, and that's a whole topic for another discussion. The engine mounts are different. So the passenger side engine mount on the Duramax LBZ, and I don't know about the LMM, I think it's the same. It's shifted to the front of the vehicle on the passenger side on the Duramax, but the Vortec engine, they're parallel. So on the 1500 platform, the engine mounting brackets are straight across from each other on the frame, whereas on the Duramax, the engine mount on the frame is 3 inches shifted toward the front of the vehicle. So you have to be able to make an adapter plate, and what we've done is we made an adapter, and I'll get into more detail on that in a different video. They sell adapters. Most of them I've seen are 3-bolt, but the GMT, I guess the LS or the Vortec engine has a 4-bolt connection on this vintage. And I'm not super familiar with, the history of all that, but I just know ours was a 4-bolt. So I haven't seen any adapter plates that are off the shelf that would work for that. But it isn't too hard if you can do a little metal work, a little fabrication. It's basically a 1/4-inch plate that we used. So that's just something to keep in mind. There's definitely some fabrication that has to happen here. So you either have to be able to pay somebody that can do the fabrication, or you have to be able to do it yourself. So just keep that in mind. The radiator and the fan. So there's, without major frame modifications, you cannot fit the Duramax radiator or fan, the Duramax radiator or intercooler into the GMT900 1500 framework. And I'll get into more detail on that. But what we decided to do on our end was I'm having a custom radiator made. The Yukon XL that we're using as the vehicle for the transplant, the radiator core is only 1 1/4 inches thick. And so I've had a custom radiator place basically fill, the tanks are about 3 inches thick, but the radiator is really thin. So if we fill the area with radiator tubes, then that'll give us the cooling we need, and we can basically keep all the same mounts and everything, and we don't have to do any kind of modifications as far as the frame goes. But we're talking like a body lift won't cover it. A body lift might gain you a couple inches. Even if you put an HD hood on there, which I don't even know if that works with this body style. You might have to do the whole front clip. You have to make up like 5 or 6 inches of space to get the Duramax intercooler and radiator in there. So we're going with a custom radiator that fits exactly the same mounts as what the Yukon's radiator was. And then the intercooler, we're doing also a custom intercooler, and it's going to be in front of the evaporator, or the condenser, I guess it is, in the front of the engine. There's space in the grill, so we're going to do that. So anyway, those are just some added costs. The custom radiator that we're getting is like in the neighborhood of $1,300. So I don't know if that's a normal price. That's what we found anyway. And then the intercooler is like, depending on where you get it, if you get a Mishimoto or something like a name brand, you're probably going to be up close to $300 for the intercooler. And then you got to do all the piping and all that kind of stuff. So just keep all that stuff in mind. So you got to do fuel tank and lift pump modifications. So on the 1500 platform, it is so tight, like there's not very many places you can put a lift pump. So our LBZ donor had an air dog on it, and so I ended up welding a bracket on the back frame behind the rear driver's side tire. And again, I'll show you that when we get there, but not super easy to find a spot to put the lift pump. So, and then the fuel tank, obviously, you're not going to be able to swap over to the Duramax fuel tank is just a completely different shape. The Yukon XL fuel tank is wide and flat and long, and it's bigger. It has more capacity, at least than the one we had. I think ours is like our Duramax tank's a 27 gallon and the Yukon is like a 31 gallon. So what we did, and we've already done the modification and we've put the tank back in, and I have some pictures. So when I do the fuel tank video, I'll kind of show you with pictures as best I can. But I don't have anything, I guess, good as far as details go on that. I'll explain it as best I can when we do that. But I've heard of people not modifying the filler neck. So some people that have just kept the same 1-inch pipe or whatever it is for the gas line. I've heard people do a 2-inch filler neck, but then it necks down to the 1-inch size at the fuel tank. And both of those scenarios with diesel fuel and the foaming are a problem. They make it really slow to fill up at the pump. Sometimes the handle clicks off all the time. So we decided to modify the tank to go to the 2-inch filler neck like what a diesel typically has. So that's a modification you're going to have to make. We left the fuel pump module and the fuel sending unit in the tank. We disconnected the wiring for the fuel pump. And then we added a draw straw, and I'll point out on the pictures where we added that. So just keep that in mind. There are some modifications that you have to make to the fuel tank. The brake booster was one that we weren't aware of. The LBZ does not have any vacuum. It doesn't have an additional vacuum port, or pump, I should say. So I think some of the older Duramaxes, like maybe the LB7 or the LLY, or maybe it was just the LB7, I don't know, had vacuum pumps, and so you have a vacuum source. The brake booster on the Yukon XL is a vacuum booster, but on the Duramax trucks, it uses the power steering hydraulic, so it's a hydro boost they call it, instead of vacuum. And so there's some differences there, and I'll get into that. They don't mount right up. You can't just switch them out. So there's a couple different ways you can do it. Some people have, modified stuff inside the cab of the Yukon, and we decided to modify the actual brake booster itself. So we'll get into that. But just know there's some additional considerations there. So one of the things you're going to have to deal with too is whether you want to go to an 8-lug configuration or try to stay with a 6-lug. I toyed with the idea of just keeping the running gear in the Yukon. That means keeping the front and rear diffs and just adapting the drive shafts to work with those. But the more research I did and the more I talked to people, I don't think that was going to be a good scenario with the torque that's in the Duramax. The torque on the Vortec engine, the 6.2 that's in the Yukon, is around 400 foot-pounds, but the Duramax is like 650, and then if you do any tuning, you're going to be over that as well. So we decided to go the 8-lug route. So I know there's people that have done, they put in an 8-lug rear axle, and then they put 6-lug adapters on. And I checked that, and that's just that'll push our wheels out like 1.5 inches wider. And the wheels that we have on the Yukon are already even with the body, so they would have stuck out even further. Plus, I don't know how the adapters will work with the hub. Anyway, we decided to go 8 lug, and if you do that, so I've bought 2 different axles. One of them I had to take back, and I got them both at a junkyard, but one of them was an 8 lug 9.5 inch ring gear, and that was off of a like 2006 3/4 ton Suburban. And I got it in there, and then I started doing a little bit more research, which I should have done ahead of time, but it's all the stuff that you learn as you go. But the vintage, so the 2006 vintage, and maybe there's a model that has it, but there's no ABS sensors, and the Yukon has the full traction control system and everything, and the rear axle has ABS sensors at each wheel. It has separate brake lines for each side, whereas the axle I got had a single connection for one brake line, and then it split it to both wheels. So just keep that in mind. So I ended up taking that axle back. Plus I ended up getting the 10.5 inch ring gear. Again, just based on research that I did, I didn't want to end up blowing out a rear end or something, especially, you know, if my wife's driving or whatever. So we opted to go with the 10.5 inch ring gear, and we had to get, so I got a 2010 axle, and I believe it's out of a Sierra truck, probably like a 6-liter or something, but you got to make sure it has the individual brake lines and also the ABS sensors in it. And we haven't connected any of that up. That's going to be an issue. So the ABS system is a whole nother thing. We're also converting to 8 lug on the front, and that requires the knuckle to be switched out, and it requires the wheel bearings from the donor. So our donor wheel bearings felt really rough, and so I figured it's time they needed to be replaced anyway, so we just got new. But the biggest consideration with the ABS, so 2 things, is one of them, I don't know if the sensors are compatible. So if I just switch out one axle with another axle and they both have ABS sensors, are they compatible? Do they still work with the computer, the ABS module that's in this vehicle? I don't know. We'll find out. So that'll be something that we'll talk about later on. Same with the front. There's ABS sensors in the wheel bearing. Are they the same? I don't know. So we'll find that out. The other thing is the gear ratio on a Duramax is a 3.73. The gear ratio on the Yukon XL Denali is a 3.42. And so to keep the Duramax happy, and it's just easier to find all that stuff, we're going with the 3.73, and we had the donor with that anyway. So I don't know if the ABS will, I'm pretty sure we have to reprogram the ABS for that. So that'll be a trip to the dealer, unless you know somebody else that has that ability with a subscription to GM to be able to program. So anyway, that'll be a future upcoming. We haven't gotten to that yet. We've started on parts of it, but we don't really know what's going to happen with that. So I talked about the rear diff, the front diff. The front diff is small on the Yukon. I'm not even sure exactly what it is. But the front diff on the Duramax donor that we had, and I think most Duramaxes, is a 9.25 ring gear. And it is definitely not a bolt-up situation. So there's, on the 1500 platform, you have a cross member right where the differential goes. And it's such a bigger differential that cross member has to be taken out, and then you have to, the mount points are different. One side is the same, the other side is different. So we're in the middle of fabricating those right now, and it's not too bad. The differential assembly between your CV joint or your CV axles is about 2.5 inches longer than the one that's in the Yukon, or 2.25 inches. And the CV axles themselves on the Duramax are about 1 inch shorter. And the splines are the same if you wanted to stick with the 6-lug front wheels, so you can just swap out the diff, keep your 6-lug fronts, and use the axles off of the Duramax. But so that's an option anyway. But just keep in mind there's definitely some fabrication that you got to do to get that front diff in. And then we haven't tried it yet, so we're going to get the diff put in, and then we're going to take it out while we put the engine back in, just so it's not in the way. And I have it on good authority that the oil pan on the Duramax will hit the differential, so you have to possibly modify the oil pan. So we'll find that out later, but I'll do a follow-up, and if we have to modify it, I'll show you what we had to do. But I do some welding, so all this fabrication stuff I'm doing myself. One of the things that I don't know, the rear axle is not a bolt-in situation. There's a whole bunch of brackets on the Yukon XL that aren't on the 3/4 ton Suburban or the Sierra truck. So I haven't decided if I'm going to try to weld those on or fabricate them, or if I'm going to take them to somebody else to do. And then I want to try to sell as many parts as possible that I'm not using. And so I don't know if I'm going to try to cut brackets off of the old axle and put them on the new axle. There's just a whole bunch of stuff that we haven't gotten to as far as that goes. And we talked about the 4-wheel drive, so that's a definite consideration. Transfer cases and electronics, everything changed from GMT800 to GMT900. So if we don't figure out a workaround and eliminate the dash display, then you're talking about a new transfer case, a new 4-wheel drive module, and then all the wiring to go with it. And the motors are in completely different spots on the transfer case if you have an electronic actuated. So you can't just swap the motors out. So, I mean, there's nothing easy about that part. And then the other thing I know that won't work, I'm pretty sure, is the intake that goes from the air box or the air filter to the air intake on the Duramax. It's a different shape going between the two platforms, so that's something else. So really a lot of this stuff, there's still some issues here that you got to deal with, but a lot of it that we've had to buy would have been on a donor truck of the same vintage. So that would be my first recommendation. There's still a lot to consider, but if you're going to do this swap, get an LMM donor instead of trying to do an LBZ. It's just that much harder. I know most people that are watching this video are probably familiar with Duraburb. They do a lot of this stuff, and that was, I mean, he said it's a few thousand more for them to put an LBZ into an LMM or into a GMT900. But if you are so inclined to do that, they only charge like a few thousand extra above what they normally charge, which I think is a pretty good deal. So anyway, just keep that in the back of your mind. So that's all I'm going to talk about in this video. Hope this was helpful for you if you're considering this swap. And thanks for watching. Consider subscribing and hit that like button if you would. And take care. Thanks.